Picture this. Roofs were ripped off the structures. The streets were underwater in one of the major top 50 cities in America. Thousands were stranded. But 20 years later, the real story isn't just how big of a storm it was and the damage it caused, but it was who was ready and who wasn't. Welcome to another episode of the Strategic Success Podcast. Guys, I want to talk to you. This is continuing on our Hurricane Katrina mini series. As many of you guys know, Hurricane Katrina in just a few days is, coming across its 20th anniversary, remembering, the damage that it did to the greater New Orleans area and region. So I want to jump in and talk on who won and who lost out when it came to Hurricane Katrina. So I'm going to take a different spin to this, but stick with me. I think this is going to provide value for folks. Let me know what you think. So I don't want to paint, I don't want to just make this about villains and victims. Like that's, I hate that narrative, right? Because it gives power to someone else and it takes power from, people, right? So So I don't like that language. I don't like that mentality. So I'm not here to say who were the villains, who were the victims, who were the good guys, who were the bad guys. Let's not do that. I want to talk about really some vital lessons that we can learn from this, obviously this paramount moment in history, especially for the New Orleans area, right? A lot of people have a pre-Katrina like line, like, did they move here before Katrina? Have they, what happened in their life? What happened to their house before Katrina and after? Their job before Katrina, after all of that, right? So the question is, you've got to beg the question, who used Hurricane Katrina as, an opportunity to really as like a springboard where they grew during that time, or who never recovered. So let's kind of look at it through those lens. So obviously Katrina, complex story. Okay. So let's kind of recap first, right? So Hurricane Katrina, it did a massive amount of damage. 80% of the city of New Orleans was underwater. In some areas like St. Bernard Parish, 90%. Lots of issues with different things with the government, response, FEMA, insurance, lots of issues across the board. And it really changed neighborhoods. It changed industries and businesses. So let's kind of look into some of those. So, disasters, they don't just destroy, because obviously, they come in, they do damage to property, and even infrastructure and nature, right? They don't just destroy, but they also reveal. So they may expose some cracks in a system. So, for example, when New Orleans didn't have the proper protocol to be able to, quickly evacuate, poor and underserved communities, the jail, different things like that. So it exposes issues with systems, right? Folks who were kind of scooting under the radar, underinsured, it exposed that. If people did not have any sort of rainy day fund in their finances, like households, right, it exposed that. If people were not self-reliant, for example, with cars or being able to, when a lot of your resources are not accessible, can you be self-reliant? Can you be resourceful? What are your plans? Do people have an evacuation plan? Do they have, a disaster plan? A lot of cracks were found. So the question is, you know, are you in a position? So what can we learn from Hurricane Katrina? Are you in a position to survive and adapt to situation? Whatever that looks like. Call it global warming, call it whatever, but these events are happening. And you've got to be able to say, hey, if this happened to my family, whether it is a unheard of storm like Hurricane Helene in Western North Carolina in the mountains. Whether it's like the fires throughout, like in the, Los Angeles area, or Maui, right? Like whatever the natural disaster is, right? Or the event, do you have a plan? Do you have your house in order? I want to encourage you to use this episode as something to get you thinking. How did your family do during Katrina, if you are from the area? Or have you ever been involved in a natural disaster? How did you guys do? Did it really take you out of commission? Were you, did you realize you didn't have a lot of resources? Did it force you to be resourceful? Did it force you to, after the fact, stock up on certain resources? Like, what did that look like? So let's talk through who lost, who didn't do well when it came to Katrina. Now, again, I want to say this. This is not meant to be, let's hand out trophies to the winners and boo to the losers. That's not the point here. I want to take this as a point to reflect and say, hey, how can we improve? How can we help ourselves? How can we help our family, our communities, our neighbors, right? So when it comes to those who Katrina took a lot from, how can you avoid that? You should ask that question when you see something. You should say, "Hey, this is horrific." Right? I think 1,800 people lost their life with Katrina. Horrific, right? But what are ways that you can, I hate to say think about success when a disaster comes, but you've got to say, "Hey, how can I prepare myself and my family so that this does not completely wipe us out?" You got to think like that. You have got to say, hey, I've got to advocate for myself and my family so that we're in a good position to where, you know, at worst, we are just managing. At best, we can, take action and do better. So let's talk about the people who Katrina really hit hard. So to kind of say this vaguely, it's those without a plan. So for example, those with no evacuation plan, or, those who had no idea if they had to get out of the city, how they would do it. So maybe they didn't have vehicles. They rely on public transportation. They don't have, you know, either relationships or, even resourcefulness. And that's going to be a word I use a lot, right? To say, hey, how can I get out of town? I'm not saying you have to have a vehicle, but can you pay someone to hitch a ride with them for their evacuation plan? If you don't have a vehicle, that should be something where early on you've got to work sooner, harder, and sooner, because it's going to take you a lot longer than someone who can just get in a car and go. And so we saw that a lot, right? With the, I mean, Danziger Bridge, right? Like the folks who you had the city trying to get buses to bus people out, and there was just so much chaos with that. Whether it is a situation where someone is poor, or they have a ton of medical needs, or think about my last episode, talk about people who refuse to evacuate because of pets, right? So there needs to be a plan, and especially if you're at higher risk, right? Medical needs, if you have, whether it's dietary needs, right? Whether it is you've got pets, or you've got young ones, or young ones with special needs, or you've got a loved one that is in an assisted care home or something like that. There needs to be plan in place, right? So those who didn't have a plan, they suffered and suffered greatly, because they then deferred their plan to a third party, which is often the government. Rarely it's nonprofits on the front end. It's usually nonprofits on the back end, right? So you're delegating having this plan, and you're delegating it to the government, which I'm of the belief there's no situation in which the government has come in, been involved, and improved the situation. So you're dealing with that, right? And so that really, again, removes power from you. When you delegate your survival, your ability to get out of harm's way, your ability to get with a secure roof over your head, or, things along those lines. And then on another hand, you've got folks who had no insurance. I know a number of real estate investors who had portfolios that were not insured. And because they were not insured, they were, really, self-insured, right? But they were not accounting for an event this catastrophic, which would then really deplete their, even if they had some reserves, right? Their resources that quickly or that exhaustively. But hey, it happened, right? So even if you don't have insurance, do you have a plan? Can you go get a line? Do you have a line of credit? Do you, and even then, if you had a line of credit, could you draw on it after a storm? That's a question I don't know the answer to, right? Instead, do you have that money sitting, instead of paying it toward insurance, are you putting that money in a CD that's earning or a money market account or something? Like, what does that look like? Other people who, I'm going to go back on the topic. It's the people who waited on government aid. They significantly, there's a significant amount of people who wait on government aid, and that can range from FEMA. So a lot of people, one of the first things people do is they will reach out to FEMA for assistance immediately after. And if I recall right, it's like $75 that FEMA will release like within a few days of the storm, which is not a lot, right? So I mean, but there was FEMA checks getting delayed, plenty of programs, whether it was maybe so like after storms, there's like a tarp program to get a tarp put on your roof to kind of stop the elements from coming in. So much, red tape with that. Things got tied up. Really, and the more folks that rely on programs and the government, the more that those resources become tapped out, right? Or limited because, they have to spread a lot around, right? Get spread thin. So the reliance slowed recovery. That's something, keep that in mind. How much of your resources are tied to the government? How much of your resources are tied to third party? It's important to think about that. And that third party may be insurance. It may be being able to get a loan. Think about those things. So, there were people, so continuing on with people who lost majorly, it was a lot of folks who were short-sighted, both homeowners and landlords who, again, they were underinsured or not insured, who they said, hey, I don't want to pay that insurance, but you know what? I'll be fine. Something happens, I'll be fine. But they, in essence, didn't have a plan to handle that level of loss, right? And so then ultimately that left a lot of properties that were unfixable. So what they had, meaning they didn't have insurance, so they couldn't just file a claim, get a check, and fix it. They also didn't have the money. And so a lot of people had to consider selling as is, whether they wanted to or not, because they put themselves in a position where they didn't have insurance as a backstop, but they also didn't have reserves or enough reserves, right? And so that left a lot of properties just sitting for a long time, hoping that an option would come out of thin air to help them. So another one that we saw, and this is a little bit kind of harder to demonstrate, but communities that didn't work together or mobilize together, I mean, so many communities got impacted during Katrina, right? And each neighborhood, each community, yes, there's general resources like insurance and government programs, but what about local resources like churches or nonprofits in the area or, were neighbors getting up and helping other neighbors? Those are some things you want to think about because there were neighborhoods that just lacked leadership or participation, any type of coordination, and they saw a lot slower rebounds. There are neighborhoods in the greater New Orleans area, one of the biggest ones being the Lower Ninth, the other one being New Orleans East, that significantly damaged areas and slow recovery. Still plenty of areas you could drive by that you can say that's been impacted since Katrina, right? So let me dive into a key point here. This isn't just about bad luck, oh, this event happened, it was bad luck, but it's also you've got to point out that it is the lack of people not having their own house in order. And I mean house meaning their collective stuff in order, whether it's things like insurance or self-insuring, things like finances, things like evacuation plans, relationships within the community, knowing your neighbors, different things along those lines. And I think this is something that I want to encourage you to reflect. Is any of this stuff that you're like, hey, wait, hold on. If something like this happened, would I be able to tie into my community? Am I properly insured? I mean, I hope you would know the answer to that, that you could look at your insurance policy and say, yes, if my house got completely, snuffed to the ground, can you handle covering your mortgage with it? Could you cover your mortgage and could you rebuild? Like, what does all that look like? you know, Knowing your position. Many people can't cover their mortgage and rebuild. Most of them would cover their mortgage and be left, maybe with just the value of the lot or maybe some extra cash on top of that. So then you can decide, hey, do I use that as a down payment and sell the land? What does that look like? These are things that you should know. What is, what's your risk exposure here in the event of some major event happening in your area? Heaven forbid it ever happens, but more people are seeing it happen than we want to admit, right? So let's shift gears here. Let's talk about who won. Now, by talking about who won, again, I'm not trying to paint the villains and the victims, and I'm not saying the people who won are necessarily bad guys. Definitely not. Some of them were just smart. And so we want to say, hey, what does that look like here? So, um, first and foremost, prepared homeowners and investors. So, what I mean by prepared, insurance. So, those who had proper insurance, it was a proper policy, who did their claims quickly. A lot of times, if you get in there, you assess the damage quickly, and then you fill out your claim early on, right? And you start that process, you get ahead of the line as fast as possible. Even if you bring in the help of a third party, like a public adjuster or something like that, right? And you're filing your claim, you're properly insured. And if you have hiccups, like for example, if they deny it, you have time to appeal it, all of that, right? Folks with reserves for both their, whether that is for their deductible, to handle things in the meantime while insurance is being taken care of. All of those things are important. For example, the reserves to be able to, tarp your own roof before waiting and just getting reimbursed by insurance, right? Limiting that damage in their downtime, right? And those with that flexibility, that foresight, right, of planning ahead and gathering those resources. A lot of them had the flexibility and they rebuilt stronger, or were able to position themselves to buy during that time. Those things are important. So another category of folks who, well, let me go back to the homeowners and investors who are properly insured. I mean, I know people who were seen as Katrina rich, right? Insurance, let's just say they got a $200,000 check from insurance. And I'm not saying that I'm not talking about this in the sense of like they defrauded insurance, but they got a $200,000 check and they were able to get the work done for 150. And all of a sudden they now have 50,000 left over. And we know plenty of people who were Katrina rich. Again, I saw people who were buying vehicles, boats, properties, right? Things like that. So there are some people who, unfortunately, I'm not going to say that Again, I'm not going to say that people were intentionally defrauding insurance and getting more, but we just saw that. We just saw that. I mean, here in Florida, I have some friends who are still recovering from Milton and Helene, and they thought they'd get a certain insurance check and they got a higher one. Well, guess what? Now they're doing additional repairs on their homes, or they're updating, the kitchen or the bathroom. When, I mean, just because they got some extra money. So that is an opportunity where, I mean, I know plenty of stories. I could just start rattling them off where I saw that with folks. So another factor of folks who won after Katrina was entrepreneurs who saw opportunity. So local businesses that pivoted fast, whether it's with construction or food or rentals. After storms, there have been times, so after a major storm, it was not Hurricane Katrina, but I did successfully negotiate a FEMA contract. And it was ridiculous what FEMA was willing to pay compared to market rent. And they were looking to come in and basically lock in contracts so that they could, place families in there. And that was something that, you know, folks did government contracts after Katrina, right? Or just the oversupply of, people in the area. I mean, think about it, hotels, especially hotels that have like kitchenettes in them and stuff like that, or furnished units after a storm. Those are people who, I mean, there were so many workers who were in town who, needed places to stay. They were going to be working long days and they needed places to rest. I mean, that's where people were able to get people who pivoted, took it, saw that opportunity and said, "Hey, we have an opportunity here, whether it's housing, whether it's selling food to folks who are like, for example, working. Maybe your restaurant had damage to the store, but hey, guess what? We're doing takeout." Things along those lines. I got my first job after Katrina. I was 15, so I don't think I was the legal age. But it was a restaurant. It's not open anymore. That opened up, but it didn't have enough staff. And I remember my family and I, because we lived right near it, we went and ate there, and you could tell they didn't have enough, bussers and all that. And so I literally said, like, "Hey, y'all hiring?" And they paid me under the table to bus tables. And but they opened up and they didn't have, they saw the demand, people who maybe didn't have their kitchens back in order, people who wanted some level of normalcy. And so they opened up fast, did what they could, maybe with a limited menu, limited, staff, things like that. But that was my very first official job, even though it was still unofficial to a degree. But I mean, entrepreneurs who saw opportunity and said, "Hey, how can we get in front of this?" Right? Where there was demand. Another one to look at is communities that took initiative. And so, I mean, I know that there was plenty of, and I've shared this before, like churches, nonprofits, groups who just organized either to welcome in groups from out of state or just welcoming in. So, like, for example, this wasn't about Katrina, but I know my CrossFit group after the 20, what was it, 2017 flood in Baton Rouge. I mean, we connected with other CrossFit gyms after that in Baton Rouge, and we went and one CrossFit gym to another, we went and did some manual labor, right? So after Katrina, we saw so many church groups coming in, so many nonprofit groups. So many of you have come up to me over the years, and when you find out I'm from New Orleans or from that area, you said, "Hey, yeah, after Katrina, I went in with this group, or I went down to help with this." And so I've always been so appreciative and thankful. I mean, I know my grandmother's house was right next to a location, like a school, where folks would position and stay at, right? Like in tents and different things like that. And she was one of the first houses. And I know people who, rebuilt her, helped her. I mean, my grandmother's house came off the blocks, on the ground. So when she had to rebuild and finally, with insurance, she got a mobile home, folks came and helped build her a handicap accessible ramp to get in, right? Things like that. These were volunteers who were coming in, giving of their own time and effort, a lot of people their own resources, and working in look, our heat down here is no joke. So in September, October, even into November and December, no joke, people coming out here working hard and helping. I'm so thankful for all of that. But the communities who were not waiting on insurance or the government, but they said, hey, who can we start contacting and get them into our area to help? Those folks, again, one thing about resourcefulness is one resource is relationships, or it's the ability to ask for help. That is a key factor for winning is saying, hey, I need help. Can you come help? And being willing to accept help. Those things are huge. Another factor of folks who won is individuals who treated displacement as opportunity. So some evacuees relocated and they started fresh in different places, got new jobs, and built better lives elsewhere. There was folks who took that as an opportunity to really reestablish themselves and took it as, what happened to them with Hurricane Katrina. They used that as a springboard for that next chapter in their life. And plenty of folks struggled truly the trauma, the PTSD, the depression, all of that, the anxiety, a lot of it that was surrounding it. Look, I get it. But what I want to point out here is that the folks who won, they didn't wait. They took action, right? They're saying, "Hey, I'm not, I may be filing for an insurance claim. I may be, working with FEMA. I may be, doing this, but hey, I'm not going to wait. I am going to, think ahead. I'm going to tap into resources and I'm going to figure it out." I think that's huge. Um, so let's kind of start to land the plane here with some of these lessons, right? So let's kind of talk through some that are, kind of in between. So Hurricane Katrina was a brutal reminder, brutal, right? Very, very difficult situation for so many people who had varying experiences. But let it be a brutal reminder that the storm doesn't decide your future. Your preparedness does. Your ability to be resourceful does, right? Unfortunately, even in the face of tragedy, some people position themselves to rise while others stalled, right? Um, a lot of that can speak to, um, you know, mental fortitude. There's a lot of people, again, with a strong mental fortitude who maybe they were not in a strong financial position, but they had a strong mental fortitude that got them through that time. That's huge, right? People often say broke is not a financial position; it's a mindset, right? Or no, being poor is not a financial position; it's a mindset, right? And so you've got to have the mindset that says, hey, regardless of what my bank account is saying right now, are you able to be resourceful? Are you able to, hey, I may not have much, but I'm prepared, right? I'm positioned, right? Versus I'm unprepared and I'm reactive, right? So I'm not trying to make this about being rich. I'm not trying to make this about, who's rich, who is poor, and all that. It's about who's ready. It was, who can respond to what life throws at them. That's an important position I want to encourage you to think about and consider. I didn't mention this earlier, but I'd be amiss to not talk about it. But I think one of the other categories of folks who lost were renters. So without having, proper renters insurance, which wasn't as prominent back then at all as it is today, it's this idea that you're at the mercy of, you can't properly, you can, with renters insurance, you can insure your stuff. But at the same time, everyone was at the mercy of contractors being available and the funds, insurance, things like that to do repairs. But ultimately, when you're a renter, um, you're in a tough position. In the event that something happens, you're not just relying on repairs being made and money being available, but you're being relying on a third party who, in a lot of ways, in a lot of states, depending on your, leases, can say the house is no longer habitable and that lease is now null and void. You know, plenty of situations like that happen where renters were also in a position where they did not do well. A lot of people say, "Oh, I want to be a renter. I don't want to be a homeowner. There's all these responsibilities that come with it. It's just so much better being a renter." I'm like, yeah, but there's some positions, like I hear that position that you're taking, but there's some situations where you have the least control in that situation is when you're a renter, right? Obviously, you're not in control of the insurance claim. You're not the one, filing it on behalf of the repairs of the house, or making those decisions, right? So those are things to keep in mind. Now, um, let's get some takeaways here and land the plane. So, we can't stop disasters. Certainly, there was a lot of things that led to the magnification of the issues with Katrina, right? Like, so a lot of the man-made issues and uh, stuff like that. So you certainly can't stop a disaster. You also can't stop government incompetency and things like that. But you can control, do you have insurance policies, proper insurance coverage? Do you have financial, you know, reserves and buffers, right? For a rainy day or a massively rainy day? Do you have options when it comes to your business, to your home? Things along those lines. What about, you know, plans like evacuation plans, or in the event of, in the event that you didn't have cell phones? That was a really big deal with the hurricane. It's not having that cell phone reception. Everyone's trying to reach out to everyone. So, in the event that you don't have phones, you don't have a credit card, do you have options, right? What do take inventory of your resources and say, where am I lacking? What are my weak points and resources, and how can I improve? And then also take account of your relationships. Do you know your neighbors? Community relationships, things along those lines, that in the event that you need to have a sense of resourcefulness when it comes to relationships for what you're lacking, do you have that? Could you rely on other folks? Who would you call, for help? And it's really important to keep in mind that the time to prepare is not when the water's rising, when the emergency is declared. It has got to be before then. That is the worst time to prepare. So I want to encourage you. I want to encourage you. If anything, let today's episode just cause you to ask some big questions and sit down and think through this. Do you have an evacuation plan? Do you have a plan for your rentals in the event of disaster? Are you positioned, or do you have gaping holes in your plan or lack thereof? So let me say it this way. If the next storm hit tomorrow, whether it's Katrina size or otherwise, so literally or metaphorically, right? It could be sickness, it could be it could be divorce, it could be your business shutting down, it could be a natural disaster, right? So it could look like a lot of things. Would you be one of the ones who, moves forward, or gets left behind, right? Like, who it takes them out? A lot of that speaks to your mental fortitude. It speaks to, your resourcefulness. It speaks to your relationships, and it speaks to your finances, right? I want to challenge you to audit your own preparedness. Again, it could be a storm, or it could be a life storm that happens, right? So, with that being said, don't get me wrong, I am working really hard to get other folks on the podcast to share about their Katrina stories. And I've actually had a number of conversations with folks who I know were active real estate investors during Katrina. But a lot of folks don't want to talk about it. And I think that speaks to the PTSD. In general, some people don't want to share their story publicly. But it's been interesting. So I'm working to get some real life accounts for you guys. But I'll be very honest, I'm getting shot down with, people who I've been friends with for a long time too. So that's been interesting for me. So with that being said, we're coming up on the anniversary on August 29th, 2025. My hope is to at least get one or two episodes with folks who were, they experienced Katrina. So if you know someone, reach out to me. I'm looking for folks who were maybe in the construction business, they were landlords, or a renter during that time. So let me know. Shoot me a message. You go to CourtneyFricky.com. Top left corner is my email. You can shoot me an email. But it's been very interesting to see my responses, trying to get folks to share their story during that time, to be open to an interview. I think it's a more raw situation than people want to express. So, with that being said, appreciate you guys listening to another episode. Tune in, more episodes to come, episodes dropping weekly. See you guys next time.